Hello, once again, audience. So I got a request from somebody in the comments to do a video on Scramble for Africa. But what I'll do is I'll break it up into various mini videos. So because grade 8 content is actually not really that much information, but you only see them like 2 periods a week or 3 periods a week, depending on the type of school you're in. So we don't see grade 8s very, very often. And so this information on Scramble for Africa, by the time you teach something this week, next week it's forgotten. So I think it's a good idea to make the video. This is the PowerPoint I use with my kids, and then we do an activity afterwards, but obviously you don't have to do all of the activities. And then obviously there's a little bit more detail and explanation and things that will appear in the activities and things. But you don't have to worry about that. This is just a summary of everything you need to know for Scramble for Africa. Let's get into it. So the first topic we need to speak about is European colonization of Africa in the late 19th century. That's basically what the Scramble for Africa is all about. The things that we're going to be discussing here is what is colonialism, what was Africa before colonization, Berlin Conference, causes of colonization, how did Europe colonize Africa so quickly, and results of colonization. So I'll break this up into about 2 or 3 videos rather than trying to do them all at once. So first thing we need to look at is European colonization of Africa in the late 19th century. One of the things you do need to know about this topic is the definition of colonization. It basically means when one country takes over another country. And usually it's done for the benefit of the stronger country. So I always make my teacher taught this to me when I was at school, and I still remember it. It was an analogy about having a brother or a sister, and your parent gives each one a bag of chips. And your brother, being the Gimba he finishes his bag of chips. And then he sees you still busy with yours, and then he takes yours too. So that's sort of what colonization is all about. It's about taking over what the other resources that the other person has so that you can be benefited. Right, did this only happen in Africa? No. Colonization happened all over the world, but Africa was part of that global land grab. So in grade 10, we do the colonization of the Americas as well. But for now, we're just going to focus on. So what was Africa like before colonization? Now I'm going to take you all the way back to grade 7. You remember Mansa Musa, you remember Timbuktu, you remember Mali. Right? So we know that Africa before European colonization was not a dark continent. So oftentimes when the Europeans spoke about Africa, they said it was the dark continent and they were uncivilized and things like that. But that wasn't true. A lot of pre-colonial African societies were very, very advanced. They had established trade networks, and they had emperors, they had a system of government, they had everything that the Europeans had. They just did it a little bit differently. Um, so basically, from about the 1400s, you had Europeans and Arabs taking enslaved Africans overseas, which if you do when you get to grade 11 or grade 12, you'll do Othello, and they'll refer to Othello as a Moor. So a Moor is basically that African Arab that is trading with the Europeans. So we know that there was that trading relationship that was happening between the African Arabs and the Europeans. And this was also about the triangular slave trade, which you also did in grade 7, basically taking people from Africa, taking them to America to work on the cotton plantations or whatever the case may be, and then taking those raw materials to Europe to create manufactured goods, which would then be sold back to Africa and the Americas. So, what does this mean for Africa? This means that a lot of African people were captured and sold, which means that Africa itself had a big problem with labor. So most of your big, strong people were taken away for the slave trade, and most of the people that were left behind were your elderly, your weak, your sick, your children, etc., etc., etc. Basically, people that couldn't be sold as slaves, and we'll unpack that a little bit later. So just keep that slave trade in the back of your mind. And keep in mind that Africans and Europeans have been trading. It's not something new that this is the first time they're meeting Europeans. So many African kingdoms at this time were independent and ruled themselves, meaning there was no white boss there to tell them what to do. They were in charge of their own kingdoms. And very few Europeans went inland. So most of the time when they used Africa, and this you also would have done in primary school, you would have spoken about the Cape of Good Hope, which was sort of like a refueling station, a pit stop. You would remember I don't know if your teachers explained this like this, but when I was in primary school, they said it was like a petrol station where they would go and restock for their journey to India. So they would never, Europeans, use the whole of the African continent. They would stay mainly on the coastal areas. And that meant that in the interior of Africa, many of the people that lived there were left largely alone in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Becomes a problem in the 1800s. So, what was Africa like before European rule? So, in the late 1800s, Europeans rushed to take land and resources in Africa. And if you have a look at this map over here, you can see the resources that Africa has. Remember, I made that analogy about the bag of chips? So, Africa has a lot of chips. We've got oil, gas, coal, copper, bauxite, gold, diamond, timber, uranium, and chromium. And all of these things are needed to make manufactured goods. If you look at oil, we use it for petrol. If you look at gas, you use it for gas stoves and things like that. Coal is used for electricity. So all of these things, Europeans kind of used up their versions of it because they had an industrial revolution around about the same time, and they were using large amounts of these natural resources. So they were looking for more because the more you have, the more you can make, the more you can make, the more you can sell. And so they were just seeing dollar signs basically. How can I make more and more money? So these European countries, when they saw that Africa had all of these resources, they wanted to rush and grab it, scramble for it. But to kind of avoid fighting over it, they had this conference, which we'll discuss a little bit later, and they divided Africa like a slice of cake. Like you get this piece, you get this piece, you get this piece. And Africans themselves were not invited. So most of this happens in the late 19th and early 20th century. I think by the around about 1910, 1920, Africa is completely colonized. I think with the exception of two countries, Ethiopia and Liberia, which you can see a little bit more about in the Fun Fact Friday. So most African history at this point is all passed down orally. So everything we know from the African perspective is through oral history. And one of the problems we have with oral history is it relies on memory. And, with broken telephone, things get lost along the way, things get exaggerated and things like that. So it makes it very difficult for historians to fully grasp the African perspective of what happened. But we do have a lot of material from the European side. So a lot of the sources that you're going to get in the exam will probably be from the Europeans writing about it or from a historian's perspective. Hmm. Why are you giving me problems? Okay. So what are the types of pre-colonial African societies? Firstly, Africa had many different types of political systems. You had the hunter-gatherer groups like the Khoi and the San, which you also did in primary school. You had clan-based groups, which was family-based. So instead of hunting and gathering, you would live within your clan or within your family. And then in other cases, you had organized kingdoms. That's where you have a king and a queen, and princess and prince, and then everybody from different families are all together. And there were about 10,000 different African states before colonization. A lot of them were completely wiped out by colonization. Some of them were split up, had to form new groups, etc., etc., etc. Before the Europeans came, every African community had its own way of ruling and organizing people. Each group had their own laws and customs, traditions, ways to solve problems and keep peace. Some examples is they would have the king and or the chief that made all the decisions. In other cases, elders would give advice, and in some cases, they had councils, sort of like we have now with parliaments, where they would discuss issues. But what we need to draw from this is that despite what the Europeans say, so what a lot of the Europeans say is that Africa was uncivilized. So despite that, we do have evidence that there was working systems of government before European colonization. So this is a map of Africa as it was known in 1800. You'll see that most of our places that is marked is right on the coast, because remember I told you the Europeans were not so much interested in what's happening here. They were all on the interior. So let's clear all that. So you can see they would sail along the coast here, and then they would set up bases here, going all the way down. So you'll see most of your bases are all on the coast. You've got a few, like here's Timbuktu, Gao, Jene. This is what you did when you did Mali. And then if you go up here, you'll see again, just the coast. Up again, just the coast. So you'll see there's no cities being depicted in the interior because they didn't really explore that side. All right. So one of the only places that we will recognize is right here at the bottom, the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Town. And this, you can see this is how Africans were seen by Europe. Like they don't know what's happening here. They only know what's happening on the coast. All right, so let's, next. All right, so the next time I see you, we will have a look at the Berlin Conference, which was basically where Africa was divided amongst the European powers. I hope you have a good time and see you next time.